When the First World War broke out in 1914, cavalry was still considered the shock force on the battlefield. For centuries, the horseman was the F-22 fighter jet of his day. Even well after gunpowder had come to dominate the battlefield, there were few infantry units that could withstand the full might of a cavalry charge. But as the 19th century progressed, cavalry began to lose its effectiveness. Infantry tactics and weapons began to render the horseman obsolete. Though it was the advent of the machine gun that truly heralded the end of the cavalryman's reign over the battlefield. However, the new weapon's effectiveness didn't become apparent until the trench warfare of the Western Front showed just what machine guns could do. Cavalry charged headlong into walls of bullets. They got bogged down in mud and barbed wire as the hail of fire from the enemy's Vickers or Maxim guns cut down men and horses alike. Then, infantry was forced to do the same, crawling through mud and blood, dashing over the tops as the bagpipes played, and getting cut down all the same by machine guns, gas, and the other horrors of modern industrialized warfare. The combatants on both sides of the war were desperate for some way to break the stalemate on the Western Front. Today, we're talking about the development of the tank. Why? Tanks are cool. That's why. An armored vehicle bristling with cannons was not a new idea at the turn of the 20th century. Leonardo da Vinci had proposed a primitive version of the idea in the 15th century. But the combatants in World War I had something da Vinci didn't. They had the internal combustion engine. The French and English were the earliest experimenters with the idea of a heavily armored vehicle on tracks. Earlier in the war, various armies had employed armored cars, which sort of worked, but they required level terrain to operate, and that was in very short supply in no man's land. Wheeled vehicles just didn't work. What they needed was something new. Tractors using caterpillar tracks had been around for a while, and the British had been experimenting with essentially slapping armor and guns on them since 1902. But it wasn't until 1915 that something useful was finally developed. The British produced the first tank prototypes in 1915. These early vehicles were long, they used tracks, and they had heavy armor capable of resisting machine gun rounds. But many of these proved to be ineffective. They got bogged down in the mud and proved incapable of crossing trenches. Winston Churchill was intrigued by the idea of tanks, but the continued failure of the prototypes almost caused the idea to be abandoned altogether. But Walter Gordon Wilson saved the concept by proposing a rhomboid shape, of all things. The new machine, which became known as His Majesty's Land Ship Centipede, and later renamed to Mother, was the first of the tanks. These prototypes of the British heavy tank proved very successful in trials, and the War Office ordered 100 units for the Western Front. The new vehicles had the potential to break the stalemate. Quick side note. You're probably wondering why tank? Of all the things to name these behemoths, why that? Put simply, security. They were referred to as water carriers and tanks in official documents to fool the Germans. The British were also responsible for the nautical terms used by tank crews. Hatch, hull, bow, ports. All of them were nautical terms, used to hide what the machines really were. The infantry wasn't told much about them during their development either, so when tanks were first deployed in the Battle of the Somme on September 15, 1916, the infantry didn't quite know what to do with them. The 32 Mark I tanks able to commit to the battle did achieve some local success, which is not bad for a brand new military technology. The next year, at the Battle of Ypres, the tanks couldn't operate in the muddy conditions. It was only in November 1917, at the Battle of Cambrai, that tanks showed what they could really do. 400 British tanks punched 6 miles deep into the German line. But it was all for naught. The infantry didn't follow up on the gains, and the Germans recaptured all of their lost territory. At Amiens, on August 8, 1918, the British sent 600 tanks against the Germans and scored a major victory. Tanks were proving their effectiveness on the modern battlefield. Though these early machines were slow and cumbersome, only capable of 6 or maybe 7 miles per hour, and with very limited range, they were more than capable of charging through the barbed wire and bullets, and punching a hole for the infantry to attack through. For all its success, the British Mark I wasn't anywhere near a modern tank, in terms of design, at least. Its treads ran all the way round its sides, and it had 2 main guns, one pointed out either side with front-facing machine guns. The German answer to the Mark I was even larger and even more cumbersome. The A7V had a crew of 18, and it weighed 30 tons. It was only introduced at the very end of the war, and they only produced 20 of them, so most German tank crews actually used captured British Mark Is. The A7V was even further than its British counterpart from the modern tank. It was actually the French Renault FT that was the first to use a rotating turret atop a vehicle with 2 treads alongside, essentially the blueprint of all modern tanks. When America entered the war in 1917, the French supplied them with FT tanks as the US couldn't produce them at the speed they needed. An American officer called George S. Patton, then serving under General Pershing, volunteered for the new US Tank Corps and became a pioneer in mobile warfare. Speaking of, it was only a matter of time until 2 tanks would encounter one another on the battlefield. A British Mark I and a German A7V encountered one another on April 24, 1918, at the Second Battle of Villiers-Bretonneux. There was no clear winner, but the battle showed the shape of things to come. World War I came to an end on November 11, 1918, and most people were relieved, but some saw that another war would be inevitable, and they knew that tanks would play an integral part in it. De Gaulle, Patton, Rommel, all of them saw these primitive tanks crossing no man's land, and they saw the potential, too. The next war would be a mobile war, and the next generation of tanks would serve as the cavalry for the modern age. But that's a story for next time. Until then, I'm Renegade Historian. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Have a wonderful day, everyone.